Reminder to please subscribe if you want more Phoenix content, by the way. I'm going to do my best to very quickly get you to the point where you can start practically using LiveView. I'm not going to cover everything. I just want to get you to the point where you can create a Phoenix project and have something in front of you. Assuming you have Elixir installed, go to a new directory and run mix phoenix new. And this is the command to start a new project. We're going to call our project demo, and it's going to take a while to complete this. Now I want to begin by looking through some of these files in a new Phoenix project, kind of going over these directories, explaining what they do. I don't want this to be Phoenix focused. I'm assuming you have a little bit of understanding of Phoenix, and we want to focus on LiveView. But I think it's important to just kind of talk about what some of these folders are. So right off the bat, this build directory here, this is where your compiled Erlang is going to go. You can pretty much ignore it for right now. Next, we have this assets directory. In here, you have your CSS and your JavaScript. Next, you have this config directory, which understandably is config files. Next, you have this dependencies directory, which is all your mix dependencies. These are what are installed here in mix.exs, this dependency list. Next, you have the lib directory, and this is where your actual source code goes, so we're going to come back to that. Next, you have this private directory, and the two important things it has are your migrations and any static assets or files go here. Finally, you have this test directory where all your tests go. Let's go back to the lib directory and look at the top level. So there's two folders and two files in here, and they correspond to two modules that get made for every Phoenix project. You've got the module that has the name of the folder we gave it, which was demo, and you have the same thing but web. And basically all the web specific stuff is going to live in here, and anything that's not web specific is going to be in here. There's not really anything in here right now because we haven't added any models, but when we add models, or as Phoenix Ecto calls them, schemas, when we add schemas, they're going to show up in here. Inside of demo web, there is this components folder, which has a very important file called core components. This has a whole bunch of things that you can use in your Phoenix project out of the box, like form helpers, buttons, inputs, all sorts of stuff. So this is a very important file, which we will talk about in more detail. There's also two layouts in here. You're probably familiar with layouts and other web frameworks, but LiveView is a little bit different. In Phoenix, we've got an app layout and a root layout, and they kind of render differently. The root layout only renders once when the page loads, but the app layout is capable of rendering more than once if we put stuff in it that's going to change. Next, you got controllers. I think you probably know what a controller is. And then there's a couple other files here that we don't need to super get into, but the one really important one to read through is the router file. The router in Phoenix is pretty similar to the router in like Rails. So if you have some kind of background in that, it should kind of make sense. So that's kind of like the layout of a Phoenix project. I think it's really important to know how to go about finding out information that you don't know. Where do you go to find out information? In the case of Elixir and Phoenix, the documentation is really, really good actually. So these pages here, Phoenix documentation, the Phoenix LiveView documentation, and also the Ecto documentation. These are pretty much must reads for you. I really recommend, if you want to get started with Phoenix or LiveView, please open this up and start reading through it. We are going to summarize some of this information as we go along, but really the documentation can take you really far in Phoenix. Now I'm actually recording this video for the second time because the first time I tried to record it, I tried to use the generators. There is a generator that comes with Phoenix. If you look up mix phoenix gen here in the docs, there's a whole bunch of generators here, and one of them is for live views. And I tried to record this whole video using the generators, and what I realized is they're kind of horrible for teaching people live view. They include so many features. They use just about every feature in live view, and it's really hard to use them as the basis of showing a very simple live view that you can then build on top of. So we are going to use the generators as a jumping off point, but we're going to delete a lot of the complicated stuff in them. So what we're going to try to make today is some kind of link aggregator, like a bookmarking service. We want to be able to log in. We want to be able to add links with URLs. We want to be able to maybe favorite the ones we like a lot, and we want to be able to edit them. So really this gets at the most important part of LiveView, which is forms, because that's the most important part of all web applications. I think when people learn LiveView, they go straight into the things that make LiveView different, which is exciting. You know, PubSub is really exciting. The features that you can do with LiveView, with having a gen server backing your LiveView, storing state in them that you share between users. All this stuff is really exciting, and it's stuff that is hard to do in other web frameworks. However, people go straight to all that stuff and they kind of miss what you're doing 90% of the time, which is building forms. So let's jump right into it. And we're going to start by running a generator for making user accounts. There's a really great generator that comes with Phoenix called Phoenix Gen Auth. We're going to run that generator, and when it's done, we're going to have user records, we're going to have logging in, basic authentication system, email sending. So we're going to pass 3 parameters to this. The first parameter is the name of the context module that these user records are going to exist in, their functions to access them. Contexts are like a way of organizing functions in Phoenix, so we're just going to call it users. Secondly, we're going to name the schema user with a capital U and no S on the end. And then finally, we're going to name the table users, plural, with a lowercase u. So we're going to run this, and it's going to ask us if we want LiveView based authentication. We're going to say yes, because we're doing a LiveView tutorial, so we might as well show it off. And then we're going to need to run mixstep get again, as it tells us, because this has added a couple packages for hashing passwords. And finally, we're going to have to run mix ecto migrate again. And once that's done, make sure the server is running. Then in our web browser, we'll go to localhost 4000, which is the default port. And we have this register and login link here. So we can go register, do demo@example.com or whatever you want, put in a password, and there we go. We created an account. As you can see, it says our email address in here. So in like under a minute, we created authentication, which is kind of cool. As I said, we're building like a link generating service. So we're going to run the generator again. This time we want to generate a links schema. We're going to use the Mix Phoenix Gen Live generator. I mentioned that its output is a little complex, but we're going to delete the complex parts. So again, we specify our context, our schema, and our table names, links, link, and links. And then with this one, we can give it a list of parameters that are going to be fields on our schema. For this one, do URL:text, and that's going to result in a link table with a URL field. Remember to go to your terminal running the server and run mix-ecto migrate again, and then start the server again. Now open your file editor of choice, and we're going to go to the lib demo web live directory, which the generator has created for us. And this is where all of our live views are going to live. So these files weren't here when we were looking at the file structure before. That's because the user auth generator added all of these. So I'm not going to go over them today, but they're basically boilerplate for logging in. We're going to go to the link live directory. And there's a bunch of stuff in here that the second generator we ran created. So we're going to delete several of these files. First off, delete this show file, both the EX file and the HTML HEEX file, and delete this form component file. We're going to start with just this index page and come into the template, which is the HEEX file, and delete everything in there. And just so you know, HEEX, this HEEX extension, think of it as like JSX in React. It's just a way to have HTML in your Elixir files. And then open up the index file and delete everything in there except use demo web live view and these 2 aliases. Actually, we can delete the aliases too while we're at it. We'll just start totally fresh. So LiveView has 3 main callbacks involved in its rendering lifecycle: mount, handle params, and render. Render is implicitly added if we have a template file, so we don't need render, but we do need mount because we're going to initialize some stuff in this LiveView. And every mount callback receives params, the session, and the socket, and returns an OK tuple containing the socket as the second parameter. The socket is kind of like the con in plug. It's an object that we're going to be acting on in like a functional manner, where every function receives the socket, we then do something to the socket, and then we return the socket. So in that way, everything is like pure functions. So just put in a mount function like this that returns OK socket, then come to the template, and let's just put an empty div in here that says hello world. And then let's open up the router file, and we want to display this down here. We're going to go down to this section here where it says require authenticated user. We're going to do that because we're going to include some features that will only work when we're logged in. So we want to make sure the user is logged in by the time they access this live view. So add this live macro. We're going to point it to links, and we're going to point it to our link live index live view, which is the same name as right here. Once you've done that, come to your web browser and go to links, and we have our template rendering. So that's exciting progress, I guess. Obviously, that's not very exciting. We want to actually render something. So let's start by assigning to this live view a list of all the links that already exist in the system. So what we're going to do is we're going to use assign, which is a function, and we're going to call one of those context functions. So we're going to call list links. And so we're acting on the socket, and then we're returning the socket. Now this module name is not aliased, so go ahead and add alias demo links. Now if we go to this definition, this is the context file that the generator added for us. So it's a bunch of ecto boilerplate. And right now this function is getting all the links in the system, but we only want the links for the current user that's looking at the site. So what we're going to do is we're going to have this take a parameter called user ID, and we're going to change this around a little bit, remove this part in repo all, and replace it with something like this. From L in link, where L.userid is user ID. It's going to look like that. This is ecto syntax, so go ahead and read the ecto documentation on this. Then come back to our live view, and we need to pass user ID in here. How do we get the ID of the current user? Well, when we were looking at the router here, this require authenticated user has this on mount section here, which runs a function called ensure authenticated. If we look that up, we can see there's a function here in user auth that is going to get the current user, and it's going to assign them onto the socket. So because of that, we can access the current user by doing socket assigns current user.id to get the ID. So with that done, we can go to the template here, index.html heeks, and we can loop through all those links and display them. There's a handy syntax to do that in LiveView in heeks files. It's this for syntax. If we do for and then brackets, we can do link in links, and this is a left arrow. And then inside of here, instead of hello world, we can display the name of the link. So we'll say link.url. And you can see it says undefined variable links. That is because we didn't put an @ sign in front of this. So everything that we add to the assigns, like this, we have to access with this @ sign in our templates. That is how change tracking works in LiveView too. it's going to look at everything with this @ sign, everything on assigns, and those variables are going to receive change tracking. So if we come back to our browser, we can see we got a bit of an error here. So it says field user ID and where does not exist on this schema. That is because we never actually added user ID to this links table. So there's two places we need to edit. One, we need to edit the schema. And secondly, we need to generate a migration for it. So we'll begin by going to the schema, which is here in demo links link. And these are the fields that exist on this model. So we need to add user ID, and it's going to look like this. It's going to belong to a user, and this means that the foreign key is going to be on this side of the relationship. Also, while we're in here, we're going to change the change set. So change sets are how you put new data into Ecto. So we're going to add user ID here. And by doing this now, it's going to make writing our forms later a little bit easier. Next, we need to generate the migration. So come back to your terminal where you're running the Phoenix server and stop it. And then we're going to run mix ecto gen migration. And we're going to say add user to links and hit enter. And then open up this file it's given us. And while I'm here, I'm going to restart the server, go back to Vim. And we're going to go up to the priv directory and open this migration. So you want to add a migration that's going to look something like this. Alter table links, add user ID, and it's going to reference the users table. We can also add this on delete clause, which will affect what happens if one side of this relationship gets deleted. But save this file, go back to your server, stop it and run mix ecto migrate, and then start the server again. And now if we refresh, we can see we don't get an error anymore, but we also don't see anything, and that's because there's no links. To solve that, let's add a little bit of stuff here. So first off, let's add an H1 that says links, so we know what page we're on. And we're going to give it a little bit of styling with Tailwind. We're going to say something like this is fine, text 2XL and font bold. And then we want some kind of a link to go to the new link page. So we're going to have a separate page where we add new links. And you might be tempted to do that with an anchor tag, but in LiveView, you're going to want to use this syntax right here, .link and .link closing tag. And then inside of that, we will say add link, and then go back to our browser and we can see the link here. So we just covered a couple things. Now, first off, this is your first instance of seeing a Phoenix component. So go back to the docs and search Phoenix component. This is very important reading. I really recommend you stop and read through this, but I'm going to summarize it for you. Basically, Phoenix components, you can kind of think of them almost like React components. They're functional, so they function on their assigns that are passed into them, and they don't have any state. They're a pure function. They only take assigns and they output HTML. They have kind of a weird syntax. It doesn't really look like any other thing out there in the web. You define them like this. They have a function name and they receive assigns. And then they have a block of heeks. So far we've only looked at a heeks file, but a heeks block will look like this. It has this tilde and H. And then when we call the component, it looks like this. It's the name of the function with a dot in front of it. And then attributes work a lot like something like React. You can pass properties into these Phoenix components. I do want to take a quick aside and say that there is another thing called a Phoenix Live component. That is a totally different thing that we might or might not get into in this tutorial, but just know that that is a very different thing. So now that we know what this syntax is, now that we know it's a component, we should probably figure out what component it is. So let's look it up in the docs, and it pops up right here. it is in the Phoenix component module, and it has a list of components that come with Phoenix LiveView, and one of them is link. So link has these three ways of navigating between pages, and you should always use this link tag wherever you're going to go between pages in your Phoenix app. The first way is a traditional browser navigation. If you use the href attribute on a link, it's going to be a full page nav. If you use the navigate property on a link, it's going to be more like a single page app where the page is going to change in place. It's going to diff the current state of the browser against what it's receiving from LiveView. And the whole page is going to change in place without a full browser refresh. And that is one of the really powerful parts of LiveView. LiveView enables you to do this in an app that is very JavaScript light. So you can get these fast page navigations, but you still have pretty much a totally server-driven app. Now there's a final option, which is patch. And patch is only used for going to the same LiveView. When you would use patch is, let's say you have like a shopping cart and you have filters for different items. A lot of times when you're building a UI like that, you want to save the filters so that if the user refreshes, they're still around. And oftentimes you'll save them into the URL. Well, patch allows you to change the URL with some new data, but stay on the same LiveView. So that's what patch is for. In our case, we're going to use navigate. So go back to the component, the link component, and we're going to add navigate. And we want this to take us to a new page. So we're going to go to /new. And this page is going to be where we add links. Now, you can write your links like this, but there's another syntax which is pretty useful. It looks like this, with a tilde and a P and some quotes, and then you put the link URL in there. And the advantage of this is that it's hooked up to the router, and it can tell us if that route doesn't exist. And you saw the error for a second there. I'm not sure why it went away, but that error was correct. That route does not exist. So let's go to the router, and we're going to add that. So we're going to make this point to a LiveView we haven't written yet, which is going to be link live new. And we're going to create it in a second. But before we do that, let's change this styling up a little bit. Let's go back to the template for index, and let's wrap this whole thing in a div. And then in the div, let's give this flex gap 2. And then this H1, let's give it flex grow. And now we kind of got this left and right thing going on. And then to the button, or the link, but we're going to make it look like a button, we're going to give it some basic classes. So we're going to make our button look like this. Background black, border black. This is just to have 1 pixel around it. Hover of background gray 700, text white, font bold, PY2, PX3, and rounded medium. And then we got a pretty good looking button. And then our links are going to display under this once we have them, but we don't have any yet. So we want this link to work, but we haven't made the live view yet. So we're going to make the new live view now. And we're going to do that by copying both these files, and we're going to rename them. So we're going to rename index.ex to index new, and we're going to rename index.html to index new HTML. And of course, I'm talking about renaming the copies. And then in the template, we'll delete everything to have a fresh start. And in new, we will also delete everything to have a fresh start. And then once we've deleted all that, we're going to make sure we name this live view correctly, because in the router, we refer to it as link live new. So we need to make sure its name matches that. So if we hit the add link button, you can see it does take us to links new, but there's nothing here yet. So let's solve that by going to new HTML and we're going to add a form in here. But before we add the form, we're going to add a header tag and say something like create a new link. And we'll give it the same styling we gave the other, and we'll give it this, and we'll give it the same styling we gave the other h1 tag. So that was grow. So that was grow, text 2XL, and font bold. And then here we're going to use a new Phoenix component that you haven't seen yet, which is called form. And this is a fantastic Phoenix component that has some pretty cool features. But in order to use it, we need to tell it what this form is for. And to do that, we need to pass a form object to it. And it's going to have the @ sign, which means it's going to be expected to be in the assigns. So we need to create this form object and pass it to the form tag. To do that, let's go to the LiveView itself for new. And let's start adding our mount callback, which is going to be mount params session and socket. Like so, and it's going to return the OK socket. And then we're going to repeat what we did in the other LiveView, where we're going to assign a value to the socket, but it's not going to be links this time. It's going to be a form. So give it the atom of form. And then the value we're going to assign to it, basically we're going to use a function called toForm. So if we look that up, it is here in Phoenix component. And toForm is a very clever function. You can pass a lot of different things to it. So you can pass a map to it that has abstract data, and you can also pass a change set to it. And that's what we're going to be doing. So we're going to say toForm change set. And by the way, the reason that we can call toForm directly is because this use demo web LiveView actually imports a few things kind of magically behind the scenes. So if you go to this demo web file, there's a bunch of stuff in here, but if you come down to the LiveView section, this stuff is going to get added to your LiveView as a macro. And if you go to this HTML helpers part, you can see it imports some stuff like Phoenix HTML, the core components we looked at, get text, that's a translation library. So I've seen some people get confused about why some things you can use with unqualified names but not others. That's because there's a little bit of magic going on behind the scenes here, and some things are getting imported that might not be immediately obvious. So toForm we have access to right away, and we can pass it a change set, but we have to create the change set. So we will assign it, and we'll say links.link change set. And we will pass it an empty link, which looks like that. And it's going to tell us that this struct is undefined. That is because we haven't aliased it yet. So go ahead and alias demo links. And it's also going to say that this call is missing something. And the thing it is missing is if we go to this file and look at change set, it has 2 attributes required, and we're only passing in 1. But we're going to change this a little bit. The generators don't do this, but it is a bit of a common practice in your change sets to add a default parameter, which looks like this, of an empty map. The reason for that is you will often use change set with an empty map to create stuff. So it's just a little bit simpler if you have the option of passing only 1 attribute. So now that we have assigned the form object, we can come back to our form and we can start adding inputs in here. So there is another Phoenix component that we can use called input. And this one is a little different because it doesn't come from Phoenix itself. It comes from your core components file. So if we come to the core components file, you'll see there's an input component here that the Phoenix project gives you out of the box. And it's up to you to maintain this. You can change the styles on it. You can change how it works. It'll grow with your project. So that's where input comes from. Basically, we want to pass a field to it. So we're going to pass a field, and that field is going to be one of the attributes on form. So put form in here, and then in brackets, we're going to access the attribute of URL, and that's going to make this a text field. So we're going to say type is text, and we want to give this a label. So we'll say this is URL, save that, and go back to the app. And now we have a URL box here that we can fill out. Let's add a little bit of margin to this heading. So let's give this like MB6 or something like that. So we've got a little bit of space there. And let's add a save button right next to this. We're gonna like put it on the right of this input. So let's wrap this in a div and add a class of flex gap2. And we'll also wrap the input in a div and give it the flex grow class. And then at the end, we're going to have a button. And this button is going to have the classes from this button, so they look the same. And it's going to say create or add or whatever you want it to say. And it looks a little weird here, and that's because we need to make these flex items kind of align themselves better. So if you come back to the template and add items end, that's going to correspond to align items end from the flex properties. And now it looks a little bit better. Now we need a handler to receive this form when we submit it. And we can do that in the live view by using a handle event callback. So this section of the docs here, which is in Phoenix LiveView in this welcome file here, and then this section on bindings, this explains a little bit about how Phoenix events work and how we're going to use handle event. Basically, there's a whole bunch of events that we can define. There's click, there's change, there's blur, stuff that you're used to in JavaScript because they mostly have a one-to-one with JavaScript events. And we can give it a name. And then in the live view, we can define a callback with that same name. And then we can change stuff about the socket. We can do whatever we need to do. Maybe we're submitting a form. Maybe we're doing whatever. In this case, we're going to submit a form. So there's actually two ways we can go about this. We could add a Phoenix click of submit. We're going to end up calling the handler submit. But that's not really what you want to do because you have a form here and forms are submittable on their own. So give the form a Phoenix submit of submit. And it doesn't really matter what we call it. We can call it anything, but we're going to call it submit. And then we're going to go to the live view and we're going to add a handle event that looks like this. And we're going to start by copying this in. When I'm learning stuff, I copy from the docs all the time. So I really recommend you get into the habit of that. We're going to rename the name of the handle event to submit. And then we're going to receive some kind of a payload here. So I'm going to call this payload. And then let's change this to just return the socket. And every time I'm writing live views, I really recommend you follow this procedure here of having the final line be the socket tuple and then doing everything you're going to do on the live view event above that return line. So if you're going to mutate the socket above where you return it. In this case, we're going to receive a payload that actually kind of looks like this. So we're going to pattern match in the head, and this allows us to pull link params out of the payload. We could do it in the function body too, but this is a common practice. Then I'm going to paste exactly what we want because I have written this ahead of time. So stop and read through this, but this is what you're going to want to write. We're going to have a case statement, and in that, we're going to call another context function. This time it's called createLink. So as you can see, all the CRUD operations exist in the context. We're going to pass it those params, and actually this needs to be called link params. And then we're going to have two matches for the result of create link. It's either going to return an OK tuple, which means it successfully created the link. In that case, we're going to put a flash up on screen that says it worked, and we're going to navigate back to the root. And then don't forget to return your no reply socket. Or when we try to add the link, it might return error change set. In that case, we actually want something a little bit like this. We don't want to use the change set directly, but we want to pass it to toForm again. And what that's going to do is when we get the change set back, if there are errors on it, when we turn it into toForm, we're going to render those errors back into the form. I don't know if we'll have time to go over that in this video, but I might make an update where we go over error handling. Now, there's only one problem here, and that is when we create this link, there's nothing in this that is going to tell us that it's for the current user. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to rename that back to params, and we're going to say that params equals link params, which comes from the payload. And then we're going to do this. We're going to put a new value into the params, which is the user ID, and we're going to get that user ID off the socket. So what this is going to do is it's going to mean that every time this form gets submitted, the current user is going to be the one whose link this is for. Also, I just realized this is supposed to be /links, not the root. But once you've done that, go back to the form. We can add a link. We'll add wikipedia.com, and we hit create, and boom, it created the link. And as you can see, I tested this out already, so I added one already. So now we have google.com and wikipedia.com. And that is functioning because here in the heeks, we have this loop where we're looping through each one. Let's make this look a little bit nicer. It doesn't look very good right now. So I'm going to add a little bit of different styling here. All right, so this is what I've come up with. You can pause the video and add this. Just a little bit of bold font on the name of the URL. And then we added the inserted at timestamp. So it's not much, but we kind of have the beginnings of something that could be an app you might want to use. We could use this to add links we want to bookmark for later or something like that. Now, so far, we haven't really utilized a lot of the live part of LiveView. We're really doing just basic forms, but I think it's very important for you to start with that. Once we have this, then we can add some of the cool stuff to it. So one of the things we might want that we can do in LiveView that we can't do in other web frameworks is very easily anyway, is we want to be able to change these without having to leave the page. We want to be able to have this form right here. So how can we do that? Well, it turns out it's pretty easy. If we go to this new form, we can kind of just copy it and go to index, and then let's paste it in index. And when we look at the app, it says key form is not found. That's because now we need to assign form in new as well. So come over to new and grab this assign here, jump into index and paste it in. And also we need to grab the change set as well. But once we've done that, now we've got the form here. And we don't have the handler, however, so we need to copy the handler over. So go back to new, grab this whole thing, and go back to index. And now we're going to put the handler in index. So now we've kind of copied everything into the main live view, but because we're in the main live view now, we don't want to navigate back to links. Instead, what we want to do is change this to return the link from this ecto call here. And then we're going to assign it to the list of links. So we're going to do something exactly like this. We're going to take the socket, we're going to assign to links, so we're going to mutate the value. And because we're mutating the value, we need to take the old value and insert the new value. because Elixir is a functional programming language. You don't get to just mutate things in place. You have to do stuff like this, where you take the old value, you pop something into it. If you're used to React, that kind of thing, this should be somewhat familiar to you. But basically, we're going to do that whenever this successfully creates a link. And once we've done that, we can come down here and use the form, and it all just works right on the page. And that is now the essence of LiveView. You have now kind of seen what the magic is here. You've taken like a traditional form and you've turned it into LiveView magic. And it's something I get really excited about. It's just so cool to mess around with this. I mean, we can just add more links and, you know, I don't know. I just think it's so cool that you can, that with this little code, we have this page editing live. Now, there's a lot of places we could go from here, but this video is getting kind of long, so I think we need to break it up. If you have some suggestions in the comments, please leave them for me. There's a lot of stuff I wanted to go more in depth on, but I wanted to keep this short and as practical as possible to as quickly getting you into the place where you're hacking on your own live views. Also, I'm just getting started on YouTube, so if you would consider leaving a kind comment or a like or a sub, that would be fantastic. But thank you very much for tuning in. I have a bunch more ideas coming down the pipeline, so I hope you really enjoyed this one.